across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today, and it is our 4th of July week. Of course, tomorrow is the 4th of July, and I suspect some of you are already celebrating. It's quite possible some of you decided to take off from work early and enjoy what could then be like a 5-day weekend, if indeed you're off today. But if you're not off till tomorrow, we certainly encourage you to celebrate the 4th of July. That's food, it's fireworks, it's a number of other things, but as we have learned, sometimes it's not the celebration of our nation's history. Today, just for fun, I posted a picture on my Facebook page as well as Instagram and had a picture of George Washington and Betsy Ross and said, I guess we've learned that these two people are a lot more controversial than we might have imagined. And it has generated lots of various comments all over the map. And I think it's just a reminder of the fact that as we get to this 4th of July week, it is an opportunity to look back on the origin of the Declaration. That is my commentary for tomorrow, but I thought I'd give you a preview for it before we have a chance to talk with Representative Van Taylor. A little bit later, Stephen Wilson will be in studio with us, and then Hillary Ferrer will be with us as we talk about her book on apologetics. So just going to cover a gamut of different topics, but along the way, we'll get into some of the issues in the news. But it is interesting to go back and look at the Declaration. Maybe near the end of the program, I might read parts of it. But if it's not familiar to you, it is certainly something that was a masterpiece, written fairly hastily, by the way, by Thomas Jefferson, as well as a number of other people that joined with him, John Adams in particular, Benjamin Franklin, and others. But nevertheless, he honestly said that he was not necessarily bringing up new ideas, but he was giving credit to a number of individuals, Algernon Sidney, which I suspect most of you don't even know who that is, as well as there are other people he cited in some of his later documents, Aristotle, Plato, the Roman Republican writers, Old Testament, and others. But perhaps the greatest person to have had an influence on the drafting of the Declaration of Independence on Thomas Jefferson was a man by the name of John Locke. John Locke wrote the 2 treatises of government, and really some people say that if you really want to understand John Locke's book, you just really need to read a previous book by Samuel Rutherford called Lex Rex. Now, if that word Rutherford sounds familiar, well, of course, sometimes we've even had John Whitehead on the program with the Rutherford Institute, because Lex Rex was the idea that the law is king. And so in some respects, John Locke was taking Rutherford's ideas, which were kind of tied up more in a theological way, and breaking them down for people to understand that indeed we have sources of revelation, and those were called the law of nature and nature's God. Well, I think we all understand nature's God part. That's the revelation that comes from Scripture, but the idea of law of nature was this idea of natural law. So when you read in the Declaration of Independence that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that idea of self-evident is that that's part of natural law. But they go on to say, and certainly Thomas Jefferson in the final draft goes on to say, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I saw our good friend Dinesh D'Souza today saying that when Jefferson tried to tie our rights to something, there was just one word, Creator. All those rights come from our Creator. And so that, I think, is important to recognize as well. But also, if you read further into the Declaration, actually, after you get through this list of all the abuses that came from King George, it also makes some other really dramatic statements, and that is the Declaration of Independence, even though it was a bold document, was not the kind of radical document you have with the French Revolution. For example, they talk about in the Declaration, and Jefferson writes down, that they were not breaking from England for what? Light and transient causes. They were mindful, as it says in Romans 13, that they were to be in subjection to governing authorities that are established by God. But they also argued that there was a point of time. There was a breaking point. And the argument was when there has been a long train of abuses and usurpations, then they finally argue that it's the right of the people to alter or to abolish it or to institute a new government. And so in some respects, this was a peoples that were certainly declaring their independence from Great Britain or from England, however you want to say it, but they were not removing their dependence upon God as well. I think it's kind of interesting that a lot of people say also there was another very significant source to Thomas Jefferson's Declaration, and you can find that in George Mason's Declaration of Rights, which was published back in June of 1776. Of course, recognize we celebrate the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776. But again, that first paragraph of George Mason's Declaration says that all men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights, among which are the enjoyment of life and liberty and the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Sounds pretty similar, doesn't it? And of course, I think that's where those ideas come from in terms of this idea. And so even as tomorrow, I will have a commentary going into some detail. On Friday, we also have a commentary in which, since we've been talking about the Declaration, what about the possibility of revising the Constitution? And I thought that one would be of interest as well. I give on a regular basis every year to the Williamsburg Foundation, which, of course, supports what is happening in Williamsburg. And so because of that, I get their magazine. And one of those was an article entitled An Exercise in Revisionism. And he simply asked, if you could change America's founding document, what would you do? As you might imagine, some of them thought maybe we should change the Electoral College, but there were others that said, no, it's protected us. There were some that talked about maybe going back and repealing the 17th Amendment because that was for the direct election of senators instead of having those individuals selected by the state legislature. And as a result, states lost a lot of power there. Some suggested that we might go back and declare that the 14th Amendment does not automatically make a person a U.S. citizen if he or she's born on this continent by people that were here illegally. At the very least, they thought maybe it shouldn't be awarded automatically. And then there were some that are suggesting, and I think this one makes some sense, that the requirement that the president be a natural-born citizen, the argument was, well, a naturalized citizen is just as much a U.S. citizen as one born in the U.S. And then, of course, there were quite a number that called for particular limits that we might put on our elected officials, especially Congress, everything from a balanced budget amendment to one that Senator Ted Cruz has been pushing forward, and that is a limit, term limits as well. But I thought it was kind of interesting while we were in the midst of this 4th of July weekend. I thought for just a minute we'd look at our Declaration, look at our Constitution. But when we come back, okay, let's look at some things. Is it possible that Nike went too far? What's that going to mean? What about some of the violence in Portland, Oregon by Antifa? So we'll get into some of those issues. And then, of course, we'll have a chance to talk with Representative Van Taylor at the bottom of the hour. So we have a lot coming up, and we will do all of that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about the progress of religious liberty in this country due to the recent Supreme Court ruling. Today, I'd like to put all of this in a larger context of the religious culture war. Fortunately, David French has already done much of the hard work on this in his commentary on this subject. Early on, he explains his mission. Although the federal government should protect religious liberty and seek the common good, we Christians have a responsibility as well. He says while citizens should seek to influence their nation through government, their first responsibility is to exercise their liberty towards virtuous ends. His first concern is that often our progressive government fails to protect the free exercise of religion that he says is plainly illiberal and contrary to the constitutional order. The government passes sweeping and intrusive statutes and regulations and then treats the free exercise and free speech claims of religious individuals and institutions as a form of special pleading. That turns the Constitution on its head. But his second concern is focused on us. He admits that while religious conservatives are right to fight for their liberties, we need to understand that no government or cultural institution is more responsible for the decline of the church than the church itself. As I've documented in previous commentaries, most surveys of non-believers and believers who have left the church find Christians to be intolerant and hypocritical. David French points us to 1 Corinthians 5, verses 9 to 12, where Paul calls for those in Corinth to focus on the sin within their church body. Often, he argues, we are more intolerant of the sin we see in the world than in the sin we see in the church. We need to be faithful in our witness before the watching world, but we also need to make sure our witness inside the church matches our words. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the issues I want to put on the table, especially since we're talking to many of you that listen in the local broadcast this hour, is the fact that in Fort Worth, they have posted a number of banners that say, "In No God We Trust." Now, those banners have been all over the city, and as a result, these were put up by our friends in the Metroplex Atheist Group. They purchased the banners that are on display in a number of different locations in downtown Fort Worth. And, of course, they're holding an event that they're using this to publicize for. That will be taking place not July 4th, but July 14th. And so that was the criteria for posting the banners. And, of course, we're going to be hearing more about that as well. Now, the city explained this. While some residents might not like the messaging on these banners, we do not currently restrict religious messaging as long as it follows the current policy and procedures for displaying banners. And so that simply says the City of Fort Worth banner policy and procedures allows for nonprofit or not-for-profit groups to place banners within the public right-of-way for the purpose of promoting an organization or a special event held by that organization. So obviously that qualifies. But I'd love to hear your comments. Do you think the city should have posted those banners? And I would love to get your thoughts. 1-800-351-1212. You can imagine that there has probably been a little bit of an outcry to the mayor, Mayor Betsy Price. This was her post. I'm going to just read it from Twitter verbatim. She says, "I was appalled when I saw the banners currently being displayed downtown, as I do not support or agree with the message. While many of us may not agree with the message, the organization did follow policies and procedures set forth by the city and downtown Fort Worth. We must respect freedom of speech. As we approach the 4th of July, we must remember that many Americans have fought and died for the freedoms we cherish today." So that's one of the kind of the local stories. In No God We Trust is on the Fort Worth banner. And so certainly this idea in God We Trust is become a little bit controversial. And apparently Betsy Ross is controversial as well. Our good friend Gary Bauer put it this way: Nike had a great idea to celebrate America's upcoming 243rd birthday with a new shoe design sporting a patriotic look by featuring Betsy Ross flag. Unfortunately, you can't buy it. Nike pulled the shoes from store shelves after Colin Kaepernick complained. Sources said that the original NFL kneeler found the flag offensive. Now, there's been some pushback as to whether or not how much of that is true, but enough of it for at least the public consumption, according to Wall Street Journal. which said Nike has chosen not to release the Air Max 1 Quick Strike 4th of July as it featured the old version of the American flag. And the argument that Gary Bauer makes is, well, this is just an excuse. Even if you had the modern flag, I don't think anybody would have gone along with that as well, as probably would have been controversial. And so, if nothing else, he says it's just another example of the left's hatred of America. Nick Pitts talked about this yesterday, but I'd love to get your thoughts as well, because what we are seeing now is that there are a couple of stories that have sort of provided some clarification on that. Of course, the original one said after images of the shoes were posted online, Colin Kaepernick, a Nike endorser, reached out to company officials saying that he and others felt the Betsy Ross flag is an offensive symbol because of its connection to an era of slavery, the people said. Some users on social media responded to posts about the shoe with similar concern. So he wasn't the only one, but nevertheless, that was one of the arguments about why the Betsy Ross sneaker didn't go too far. What you have had since then are a series of various Twitter posts. I'll read just a few to give you a sampling of how people have reacted. The New York Times opinion page, so somebody wrote it, but it just says opinion, said the myth of America as the greatest nation on earth is at best outdated and at worst wildly inaccurate. If you look at data, the U.S. is really just okay. And that always reminds me of Michael Medved, who's been on the program with us before, but if you've ever listened to his radio program, he always talks about this as the greatest nation on God's green earth. And he says that there are always people that come up to him, no matter when there's the latest survey that's come out or something like that, saying, well, do you still hold to the fact that it's the greatest nation on God's green earth? And so he always comes back to them saying, okay, who would you put as number one instead of the United States? Sometimes you get some answer like Sweden or Switzerland or something like that. And having just been in Switzerland, I can say there was some real great things about that country. But I think most people have given a choice, would rather live here. Even yesterday I was getting my hair cut. My barber was reminding me that Switzerland has a 60% tax rate. So, yes, better be good for 60% of your taxes going to that. And on those. Then you've had, let me just give you a couple other examples here. Rod Blue said, I stopped buying Nike products long ago and won't ever again. Good for Arizona to take this step, but don't stop here. Cancel all the other tax-funded incentives you're giving to these corporations. He's getting us to one of the quotes I'm going to give you from just a minute. I might as well give it to you right now. Doug Ducey said, Nike is an iconic American brand, an American company. This country, our system of government and free enterprise have allowed them to prosper and flourish. Instead of celebrating American history, the week of our nation's independence, Nike has apparently decided that Betsy Ross is unworthy and has bowed to the current onslaught of political correctness and historical revisionism. Then goes on to say it is shameful retreat for the company. American businesses, and if anything, should be proud of our nation. And then he goes on to say that Nike has made its decision. Now we're making ours. I've ordered the Arizona Commerce Authority to withdraw all financial incentive dollars under their discretion that the state has provided for the company to locate here. Arizona's economy is doing fine without Nike. We don't need to suck up to companies that consciously denigrate our nation's history. And so, again, it goes into, I won't go into the rest of it, but it's just been amazing how that's played out. Let me give you one more. Josh Hawley, of course, is a senator from Missouri. Nike thinks American flag is a symbol of oppression. What planet are you on? Nike gladly allows Chinese Communist Party to tell it what products to sell while building its business around sweatshop labor. Nike is anti-American, pure and simple. So that is part of the controversy. But probably the best argument that I saw about Nike, and we'll get to some of the attacks on the conservative journalists up there in Portland later, but this one coming from the editorial board today of the Wall Street Journal, which I sent around to some of our friends, Nike's patriotic fumble. The company makes an in-kind donation to Trump's reelection. And so they take on the story. He said, we commend Nike executives for their original patriotic instincts, assuming they were sincere, But they didn't think this one through, they said. Last year, the company launched an ad campaign featuring a black and white photo of Kaepernick bearing the words, "Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything." Well, they go into some of the story about Colin Kaepernick and the rest. But if nothing else, I love some of the lines that they end the particular editorial with. They say it's also worth remembering that hair-bearing controversies like this give many Americans a not unreasonable sense that their country is being maligned by pampered social justice warriors. Donald Trump has reaped enormous political benefits from the ill-judged fashion among NFL players to kneel during the national anthem. And they conclude with this telling line. If President Donald Trump wins re-election, perhaps he should write a thank you note to Colin Kaepernick and Nike. So these controversies certainly have a dramatic impact on the perception that people have, and maybe eventually could have an impact on even how some people vote. We don't know, but my suggestion to Nike, and I don't know how many people in the Nike Corporation listen at this hour, although I do hear that we may be getting a radio station soon in Portland, and that means at least some people that work for Nike actually could be listening to this. My suggestion to Nike is the same suggestion I give to Target, to Home Depot, to Lowe's, and dozens of others. Just stay out of the culture wars. It doesn't help you. Even when you're trying to please one constituency, you're alienating another. I have an African-American neighbor that does business, and he says, the other day I had somebody talking about something. He was, I think in that case, a pro-Trump person. He says, if that person in my business talks it up too much, maybe half the people like it, but the other half of people don't like it. Better in the business world, just stay out of the issue. Whether you're anti-Trump or pro-Trump, whether you're for America or against it, this could really affect the bottom line. And more importantly, might not affect Nike, but it could even affect the next election. Let's take a break. Representative Van Taylor probably has some ideas about some things taking place, so we'll get his comments right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
4th of July week, and of course we spent a little bit of time in the first half hour talking about kind of the origins of the Declaration of Independence, the desire for some to change the Constitution. Some make sense, a lot of them do not. And of course we then talked about Nike and their patriotic fumble, as probably a lot of people have been talking about. And I suspect our next guest, Representative Van Taylor, might want to address that. Also, we want to look at the fact that he, no doubt, has heard about, even though he said he was not going to watch, the Democratic debates last week, and I know he has some perspective on that. So again, we bring back to the microphone Representative Van Taylor, representing the 3rd Congressional District in the state of Texas. And Representative Taylor, always great to have you on the program.
Oh, great to be back, and I appreciate your accommodating my schedule. I'm actually driving from my 18th coffee with your congressman that I just had in Allen, Texas. So appreciate you having me on.
Well, again, you've served in the military, so I thought for just a minute I might get a comment. You're, of course, back here in Texas, but when you're up there in Washington, D.C., there are all sorts of people that are upset about what's going to happen tomorrow. And I love what Jim Garrity says. Trump's tanks are not a scandal. Just because we're going to have some of that military hardware, which you used to be involved with when you served overseas, and there might be a display and not a parade, that doesn't mean we're turned into a totalitarian dictatorship, does it?
No, I have to say, I actually, when I got back from Iraq, I helped out the Greater Dallas Veterans Council with their Memorial Day parade, and organizing that and contributing to that financially and just trying to help that move along. And we had, marching bands from Dallas high schools. We had ROTC units marching in that parade. We had flyovers from Guard units and active duty units, and we had, commemorative aircraft. We had military hardware. We had, Jeeps and tanks and all kinds of things in that parade. That's been going on for literally decades here in Dallas. It's the biggest DFW parade we have in here in DFW area, and I just, it's kind of blows my mind. They say, hey, we're gonna have a national one, and somehow that's some kind of terrible thing. We've had that tradition for quite a while.
Yes, man, again, I just wanted to put some perspective in that. We may talk about it later, but one of the pieces that came out by the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal about those debates last week was Bernie Sanders won the debate. Now, they say he may not be the nominee, but he has set the Democratic agenda. And the point they're making, and the point we've made around this table, and certainly we had some really good commentaries just the other day from everybody from Kelly Shackelford to Dr. Merrill Matthews, is what used to be an outlier position that only Senator Bernie Sanders held to, like Medicare for all, or aggressive working on climate change, changing our immigration laws, actually giving free college and forgiving college tuition. Those used to be only maybe ideas that were held by Bernie Sanders or one or two others. It seemed to be almost universally held by most of the Democratic candidates that we heard from Wednesday and Thursday night last week.
Yeah, it is incredible to watch the shift within the Democratic Party, and I'll give you a data point that I think kind of crystallizes what you're saying. Joe Kennedy, Democrat from Massachusetts, who is unquestionably, has, impeccable liberal credentials, right? He's called for the impeachment of the president. He's, signed on to Medicare for all. He has signed the Green New Deal. He is, I think he would wear this badge of honor that he's almost as liberal as they come. He has a socialist running against him in the Massachusetts Democratic primary, running against Congressman Kennedy from the left. And so I think you're seeing a very strong struggle within the Democrat Party about their future and who they want to be and where they want to go.
Well, and one of the concerns that I'm starting to see as well, and I wrote about this the other day, is that you have Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch criticizing Congress for the fact that they don't have laws that are specific. One of his quotes is, "A vague law is no law at all." And you have talked about on this program numerous times how if that was a problem in the past, it's really a problem now in the present, because the House of Representatives, where you serve, is made up of a number of individuals that intentionally write vague laws, sloppy laws, ones that are message laws, are bills, basically, that are attempting to simply send a message, knowing full well it won't pass in the Senate or it won't be signed by the president. And that sloppiness, if it continues, means that we're going to have more and more of those vague laws that people like or at least Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch needs to strike down.
Yeah, and I think there are two separate issues there, and so one is messaging bills, and so you watch at least within this Congress, the 116th Congress, you're watching virtually all the major Democrat bills are intended to be messaging bills, are not intended to be law.
Wow.
To be law in the U.S. Congress, you've got to have in the House of Representatives, you need to have a majority of the Republicans vote for that bill. And you can draft bills on pretty much any topic the Democrats have so far heretofore brought up that would get a majority of the Republicans to vote for it. They would be a little more limited in their scope, but ultimately they would have the chance of becoming law because we get a majority of Republican congressmen to vote for it. It then has a chance in the Republican-held U.S. Senate, and then has a chance to be signed by the Republican president. The second piece to this, so that's kind of one issue, is messaging bills. The second piece is why is legislation, even legislation that actually is intended to be law, why is that written so vaguely? And that was something I did not understand when I got there. When I got to Congress, I knew that the congressmen were handing power to the executive, and I couldn't really quite figure that out. But what they were doing is they were writing laws that were vague, that were sloppy, that were, in my Texas experience, would be unacceptably vague. They gave too much power to the executive branch. But what I realized is because they are so poor at passing anything, and they have such a difficulty in getting their legislation through, they throw power over the executive branch, which then empowers the executive branch and the judicial branch, right? So it empowers both of those branches. It disempowers the legislature, which is supposed to be the people's voice, right? That the people are represented through the legislature, not as much through the executive, and not really at all through the judicial branch. And so I think people get more and more frustrated as they watch Congress pass laws that are vaguely written that hand power over the executive. A good example of that would be the Affordable Care Act, President Obama's law or Obamacare as it's often called. I mean, that law was a 2,000-page law that required 250,000 pages of regulation. So a lot of the law had yet to be written because it was written so vaguely when it left the U.S. Congress.
Well, a good example is if you read through that law, and I took the time to do some of it, and so certainly people like Louis Gohmert and others read all the way through, you saw time and time again, as the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall determine. Sure. And so that was 2,000 pages of regulations just instantaneously, and like I said, 250,000 pages by the time you had all of that finished, simply because all sorts of power was ceded to, as you said, the bureaucratic individuals that are not going to stand for re-election, weren't elected in the first place, never have to stand for re-election, whereas you individuals have to stand for re-election every 2 years. Yep.
Yeah, and I'll use another example from my Texas legislature days. We had a very tragic incident where a young man a young high school student was killed by a designer drug in Frisco, Texas. His father and mother, obviously distraught, brought this to my attention, and worked on a piece of legislation. What was interesting is the designer drug was actually not illegal under Texas statute because we only meet every other year, and the compound, the chemical compound that killed this young man, was a synthetic cannabinoid, so it was a synthetic marijuana, and that synthetic marijuana killed him, but it was not illegal. So what we did in the Texas legislature is we actually created a emergency scheduling bill that allowed if DPS asked for it and Health and Human Services approved it, the governor, speaker, lieutenant governor all signed off on it, it would make a drug illegal, but only until the legislature met again. And that was, we were giving some power to the bureaucracy, and it was very unsettling to me to give that much power to the bureaucracy, but I needed to make that drug illegal in order to allow law enforcement to do their jobs and to prosecute drug dealers. And what was really shocking to me was finding out that the federal government decades ago gave DEA full authority to schedule drugs and make them illegal. Congress has not passed a scheduling bill to make drugs illegal for decades. I mean,
wow.
So that power left the U.S. House of Representatives. They don't even know that they don't have that anymore. I mean, there's nobody there that's passed that bill. They don't remember having done it. You got to understand, people are going to jail for the rest of their lives for trafficking and violating a regulation.
Incredible. We're going to take a break, continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Representative Van Taylor. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Representative Van Taylor with us for a few more minutes as he's traveling from one of the events that he was just a part of. And Anna told us that we might want to talk about a couple of things. One is your Congressional Veterans Commendation Program, which only applies to those people that are in the 3rd Congressional District. You have an internship program. And I want to come back to one of the pieces of legislation that you've talked about as well, because it was part of our Friday roundtable discussion. But let's talk about the Congressional Veteran Commendation Program.
So the Congressional Veterans Commendation is an award that Congress gives to recognize veterans for their service in the military and afterwards. This is a program that Congressman Sam Johnson had. He recognized many veterans over many years, and we're going to be continuing that program. And you can go to my website, my congressional website, and sign up and nominate someone there. And we'll do the research. Nominations are due by August 1st, and we'll go through and pick someone, and then the award ceremony will be in December.
Yes, again, that will be taking place later. Again, you can go to vantaylor.house.gov. Also, I guess you have accepting internship applications as well?
Sure. Yeah, we're accepting internship applications for this fall. We've had numerous people, interning for me in Washington and here in Collin County in the 3rd District, and so people really enjoy that. It's great for young people to get a chance to see public service and see how the federal government works, and hopefully go on and contribute more to their community because they have a better understanding of the federal government.
One other piece of legislation, we talked about this on Friday. Dr. Merrill Matthews was with us, and of course we were talking about the kind of transparency we need in terms of billing and health care and the rest. But we also talked about your piece of legislation that you would like to move through, which is on the back end, which is called Surprise Medical Bills Act. Sometimes you do not know that this is going to be billed outside the network, and you, because you are so willing to hear from some of your constituents, have had some people that have had some horrific surprises. So tell us a little bit more about that piece of legislation. We talked about it last Friday. I want you to talk about it again if you could.
Yeah, so and actually one of my coffee in McKinney, Texas this morning had someone talk about surprise medical billing, an unfortunate story that has happened all too often, and then I've had many people take advantage of my 100% meeting policy, and the first so today is actually the 6-month anniversary of my swearing in Washington on January 3rd, and so I've actually had 250 individual meetings with constituents in that 6 months, and people have come to me and told me about their horror stories where they go in to have an elective procedure. They do their research, they do their homework, they ask the questions, they think that they're completely covered. All they got to do is pay a copay, and then the insurance company is going to cover the rest of it. And then they, lo and behold, get an absolutely massive and sometimes bankrupting bill. I mean, I've had people break down in tears talking about how it's going to this medical bill is going to put them in bankruptcy. And the fix for that is a piece of legislation that was actually adopted here in Texas. My good friend Kelly Hancock, State Senator from Fort Worth, carried this into law, and it basically sets up a pricing regime. And then if the provider or the insurance company doesn't like the price, they can go to what's called baseball styled arbitration, where it requires the arbitrator to pick one of the two prices, either in or you're out. So if the provider wants $100, or the provider wants $200, and the insurance company wants to pay $100. The arbitrator has to pick 100 or 200, cannot pick 150, which then incentivizes people to kind of be more outrageous and more outrageous in what they want, and then more parsimonious in what they're willing to give. So baseball arbitration, and it's worked well in other states. You see it's a very effective piece of legislation. The problem with what we've done here in Texas is it only affects state insurance plans. It does not affect federal insurance plans, so particularly the ERISA plan, which most Texans have employer-based insurance under their ERISA insurance, is not covered by the state legislation that Kelly Hancock and the state legislature passed this session. That's why it's so important that the federal government, the U.S. Congress, act to protect employer-based insurance with this particular piece of legislation, and introduced it on a bipartisan basis last week in Congress, and already gotten a really great response, including from the one person this morning that expressed concern about this problem.
And I might just mention the one thing I've always appreciated about the fact that even though you are a very strong conservative and always have been, you have worked to develop a bipartisan outreach, not only when you were in the Texas House and the Texas Senate, but now in Congress. One of the co-sponsors, Donna Shalala, I think people would know that name, so it illustrates again how this is at least something that has the possibility of passing and doing a great deal of good. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about Van Taylor, you can simply go to vantaylor.house.gov. I notice we've done a little bit to also publicize this idea of an internship, so if you'd like to know more about that, that's all available at the website as well. So just before we go, any final comments? I know it's a 4th of July week, and I'd love to hear any thoughts you have for our listeners.
Well, I'll just say, I'm a Marine. I take my mission statement from the Declaration of Independence itself, and I'll just quote the second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To ensure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And so my interpretation of that is God gives us our rights, and we trust government to protect those rights. That the purpose of government is to protect the rights of the individual. And that's what I fight for every day, is protecting the rights of the individual, and to make sure that the purpose of government is to protect those rights and not to take them away. And so with that, I wish everybody a happy 4th of July, and it's always good to be on with you, Kerby.
And Van, wish you a happy 4th of July as well, and look forward to the next opportunity. Thanks for being with us today.
Sure.
Let's, if we can, take a break, and when we come back, we're going to have in studio, first of all, Stephen Wilson's going to be with us. He's with Gateway Church, but has an outreach to prisons, and I think this will be of interest to you, and then we'll get back into some of the news. Of course, we'll be focusing again on Nike's patriotic fumble, as well as thuggery comes to Portland and what is happening there in terms of some of those investigations, and a couple other issues we will certainly get to. Those are all topics we certainly like to address here on Point of View. And then also we've posted one article which I thought would be kind of helpful, and that is what progressives should know about Trump voters. This is by Victor Davis Hanson. He's been on the program with us before. It really kind of has 10 things that are why you see a number of people, even though they may not like the personality sometimes of Donald Trump, maybe they don't necessarily agree with everything that he does. Sometimes when he actually is not successful, they still are supportive of him. And this was a piece that appeared in CNN's website, even though Victor Davis Hanson would be considered a conservative. And I think it helps maybe explain, like you said, to people who say, I don't understand why they support Donald Trump. Well, at least he gives you 10 very good reasons. And if we have some time, I'll spend some time talking about that. If not, you'll find that article on the website. And in the third hour today, we're going to be talking with Hillary Ferrer, founder of what's called Mama Bear Apologetics, and that's the title of her book. And she's put together a number of women that deal with this area of apologetics, and so I thought that would be kind of a fun program for you as well. As a program note, tomorrow, of course, we will be running a tape, but you'll hear my commentaries on the Declaration of Independence, as well as a number of other topics related to the 4th of July. And so I hope that you will be with us and maybe even take the time in the midst of the free time that you may have tomorrow between going to picnics or fireworks to listen to Point of View and learn a little bit more about a nation's history. So a lot that we have coming up, but let me encourage you to go to our website to find some of the articles that I've already mentioned and others that we will talk about. My Viewpoints commentary is there today on the religious culture war, and so feel free to visit the website, download some of those articles, and if you can click on that button that says donate, we'd greatly appreciate your financial support. Let's take a break. We'll talk with Stephen Wilson in studio right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our 4th of July week and the day before the 4th of July, and we're going to get into a little bit more of that later this hour. Let me just mention that my commentary tomorrow is on the origin of the 4th of July, and I take you through some of the things that were influential in the life of Thomas Jefferson in writing the Declaration of Independence and the idea of nature's God and the laws of nature, and how indeed this was certainly a bold document, but not a radical one, declaring our independence from England, but still also declaring our dependence upon God. So that is a commentary that will be coming out tomorrow. And then on Friday, my commentary is called Constitution Revisionism, and that is one of the things I've done over the years is support Williamsburg, and because I do so every year, I receive their magazine, and the latest one is where one of the writers asked people to say, if you could revise any part of the Constitution, what might you do? And as you imagine, there were questions on everything from the Electoral College to the 14th Amendment to maybe some really wise ideas of a balanced budget amendment and term limits, which, by the way, Senator Ted Cruz has proposed more recently. So we'll talk about some of that, and a little bit later this hour we'll get into what many people have called Nike's patriotic fumble. Hasn't worked out so well with those sneakers. And a little bit, one of the articles on thuggery comes to Portland, and whether or not the fact that we'll have some tanks in Washington, D.C., whether that is actually a scandal and bringing about a totalitarian dictatorship. It's not. But nevertheless, we'll get into all sorts of silliness in a few minutes. But I have in studio with me Stephen Wilson. And one of the things, if you've listened to this program, that we talk about so often is prison ministry. We've had individuals that have been with various prison ministries, with various churches, various national organizations. We've had some people in studio that have actually served time in prison or have been wardens. And I wanted you to know about the outreach that he has put together. He's as a pastor for Gateway Church, and that prison ministry has existed for a number of years. Before that, actually started the G3 Prison Ministries. Individual that knows about prison from the inside and outside. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Has earned his master's degree from Liberty University and has been accepted by King's University to pursue a doctorate of ministry degree as well. And so, Stephen, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you for having me.
Talk about how you got involved in this. You know, Chuck Colson says, I probably never would have developed a prison ministry if I hadn't gone to prison. Maybe you could say something similar, right?
Yes, I could say something very similar. You know, the first time I was incarcerated 15 years ago.
Yes.
And when I went into county jail, there was just a fear of the unknown. I didn't know what to expect or what was going on. So my very first night inside county jail, I was sitting there on my bunk just observing what was going on around me, a little scared, you know, not knowing what was going on. And I saw a group of gentlemen gather over in the corner of that dorm. And I was just watching, trying to see, okay, what's going on here? You know, I've seen too many movies and TV shows. And so I just watched them and just observed what was going on. And they stood there and talked for a few minutes. And then they reached out and took each other's hands and bowed their head in prayer.
Wow.
And as I sat there and watched that, Kerby, my heart just went out to those guys. You know, just seeing in the midst of this crisis type situation, they were gathering together in prayer to just lift up their families and their kids and their situation. And when it was over, I went over and talked to one of the guys and asked him, you know, what's going on? He said, well, this is our prayer circle. And we get together every evening and just pray for, each other and just lift each other up. And from that time on, I said, okay, God, I know where I'm called. I know what I'm going to be doing when I get out. And so that's what started it from that time on.
Well, and as I understand, you became a believer. I mean, you grew up kind of a Christian home, but you became a believer. And that's when you said, you know what? I need to confess to a crime that nobody knows about, right?
Yes, sir, I did. So I went and turned myself into the authorities.
Wow.
and started that progression. But you know what? I knew God was with me.
Mm-hmm.
He was carrying me through this and walking beside me the entire time. So that gave me a strength to walk this journey. And so when I got out, I knew I wanted to go back into prison, but in a different aspect this time. And so that's when I went back to Liberty, got my master's degree, and started my nonprofit, and came on with Gateway back then, and actually in 2010 as a ministry outreach partner through their global missions. And we were doing outreach events for the last, 8 or 9 years in that aspect of things. And then earlier this year, Gateway decided that they wanted to plant churches inside prisons, and that started this next chapter.
Well, I want to talk about that. And first of all, one of the reasons I want to do this is for people that are around where you are, they could go to a Gateway church and find out about this. But I recognize that we broadcast in 43 different states, so a lot of people are saying, okay, I've never even heard of your church, but maybe I can learn about what our church can do. But you're actually talking about planting a church inside a prison. That's a little bit different than anything we've ever talked about before. So I'd like to have you explain that.
Yes, I would love to. Now, I can start off by saying it's all because of our leadership here in Texas and the Texas Department of Criminal Justice that we're able to do these things.
Mm-hmm.
Our leadership really has a heart for reentry and rehabilitation for these men and to work with them while they're inside. I always like to say today's offender is tomorrow's neighbor.
That's right.
So why not go in there and let's work with them now? Once we get out, or once they get out, then it's just too late. It's too late.
Yes.
And so we decided to start doing ministry inside. And here in Texas, we started fulfilling a need of building the family structure.
Mm-hmm.
So we started out at Gateway doing those outreach events, just focusing on marriage and parenting.
Mm-hmm.
Because I thought if we could get that family unit back together, there was just a better chance for that man to succeed when he got out. So that's how our church started. Was just taking marriage ministry that we were already doing at Gateway and taking it inside. So the exact same things we were doing, we just replicated it inside. We're not recreating anything. We're not reinventing the wheel. And that's what I tell churches to do. Take the ministries that you're doing in your church right now and just move it inside behind the walls and do that exact same ministry.
What kind of a permission do you need to get? Because, again, some of our listeners might be in parts of the country where their churches maybe aren't as well received as they might be, say, in the South. So what kinds of procedures did you have to go through?
I basically just did a search for local prisons around here, looked up a phone number and called it and asked for the chaplain inside that unit.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got him on the phone, then I just said, chaplain, what are your needs? What are you seeing inside your unit and how can we help you? And that started the ball rolling for us. And around here, they immediately said, if you have anything to help the family, marriage or parenting type curriculum, we would love to have it.
And what I think you're finding is that a lot of individuals that are in the prisons are looking to try to partner with a reputable organization because they recognize that we're just so busy day to day to keeping everybody fed and clothed and staying within the walls of this prison that all these other programs are things that we would be glad to outsource. And so when you come down the road with a program that's been successful outside the prison that could help with the issue of recidivism and things like that inside the prison, they're usually accepting of that. So let me take a break because we're coming to a break already. And Stephen Wilson with us. And if you'd like to know more about him or if you'd like to contact him, because you might say, well, this is something we could do in our church, but I need some next steps about what that might look like to actually plant a church inside a prison. We'll talk more about what that means and how that plays out. But again, we have a lot of that information on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation with Stephen Wilson. Then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about the progress of religious liberty in this country due to the recent Supreme Court ruling Today, I'd like to put all of this in a larger context of the religious culture war. Fortunately, David French has already done much of the hard work on this in his commentary on this subject. Early on, he explains his mission. Although the federal government should protect religious liberty and seek the common good, we Christians have a responsibility as well. He says while citizens should seek to influence their nation through government, their first responsibility is to exercise their liberty towards virtuous ends. His first concern is that often our progressive government fails to protect the free exercise of religion that he says is plainly illiberal and contrary to the constitutional order. The government passes sweeping and intrusive statutes and regulations and then treats the free exercise and free speech claims of religious individuals and institutions as a form of special pleading. That turns the Constitution on its head. But his second concern is focused on us. He admits that while religious conservatives are right to fight for their liberties, we need to understand that no government or cultural institution is more responsible for the decline of the church than the church itself. As I've documented in previous commentaries, most surveys of non-believers and believers who have left the church find Christians to be intolerant and hypocritical. David French points us to 1 Corinthians 5, verses 9 to 12, where Paul calls for those in Corinth to focus on the sin within their church body. Often, he argues, we are more intolerant of the sin we see in the world than in the sin we see in the church. We need to be faithful in our witness before the watching world, but we also need to make sure our witness inside the church matches our words. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Stephen Wilson in studio with us for a little bit longer, talking about a prison ministry, but a very different kind of one. And if you've listened to the program for any length of time, you know that we've talked about how some in prison can get their Bible college degrees. Some have been able to get seminary degrees. But this is a little bit different. I thought you would like to know about that, of actually planting a church inside a prison. And so Stephen Wilson here with us. And one of the things I've already taken away from your experience is it's the old KISS principle. Keep it simple. You know, if you already want to start a ministry inside the prison, just take something you've been using outside the prison and take it in there. You know, don't hire new staff or anything. If it worked in the church, it's going to work probably in a prison. But you went from there to not only holding marriage conferences to planting a church. What does that entail?
Yes, so we actually do a service each week inside the prison, and we're just taking the gateway service that we do out in the world that they see on a normal weekend, and we're taking it inside the prison. We're showing that video of Pastor Robert Morris, and we have actually gone in and trained the offenders on how to be leaders inside the church. So we take our gateway material of how we train our volunteers out in the world, and we take it behind the wall. So we have trained them how to do worship, how to be greeters, how to do prayer team, how to do live production. And they are doing that inside the church.
That's amazing.
So it is. It's just my vision, Kerby, was really to get these guys to be leaders in their church. So when they walk out, they could go into any church in America and step up and be a leader in their local church, in their local community. So we're just training them on what we're already doing. So we do that service every week inside the prison. And it's amazing just to watch the lives that are being changed inside that. But we took it a step further. Besides just showing the DVD, we took our discipleship classes that we do out in Gateway, and we're taking those inside. So we're focusing on 5 areas. We're focusing on spiritual growth, on marriage, on parenting, on financial stewardship and leadership development.
Wow.
So we're just, again, like I said, just keeping it simple. The things we're doing out in Gateway Men's or Gateway Marriage stuff already, we're just taking it in. The exact same curriculum, teaching it the exact same way.
Well, and again, one of the concerns that we've had when we've talked about prison reform, as a matter of fact, one of the pieces of legislation that was passed by the Trump administration, by Congress, and signed by Donald Trump, was this idea of criminal justice reform. And there's a lot more that needs to take place, as well as prison reform. But the biggest issue is when you have somebody and you sit them in a prison, there's nothing that's going to help them be successful out there. So that's one of the reasons why we work on everything from vocational training. Sometimes they can't even read and write. We work there. But as important as all of that is in terms of the kind of academic side, you know as well as I do, the spiritual side is equally, if not more, important. And, of course, we do have chaplains, and I'll give them credit for that, and we do have some outreaches. But this is, I think, one step further that I'm hoping some of these churches would think about. Wouldn't it be possible for you to take your church service inside the walls of a church and, in a sense, provide leadership, discipleship, and everything so that you almost have trained volunteers when they come out?
That's exactly right. They're ready to go as soon as they walk out the door. And everything we do is geared towards that rehabilitation and that reentry. Because like I said, these guys are getting out sometime. So let's get in there and train them how to be leaders in their family, leaders in their church, and leaders in their community. That way they're just a step ahead once they walk outside that gate. And again, the sad reality is that the federal government or the state government can provide money, it can provide security, it can provide staff, but it can't provide the spiritual. And that's exactly what the church can do. Okay, some of the questions that obviously people might be thinking about, Stephen, a pastor listening to this right now says, this is something maybe I could do in the prison. How much of an additional expense am I going to have to encounter when all of a sudden now I'm taking my church service that we do on Sunday into a prison nearby? What about that? The financial aspect of things is very inexpensive, very easy for us. Every week we take in DVDs of our service because they don't have internet inside the prisons here in Texas. Yes. So we have to burn it down to a DVD, and we have a pastor that goes each week and oversees that service inside just like a normal campus pastor would. He does oversight for it. But expense-wise, all he has to do is just pay for those DVDs and gas to get to the prison. So it's very low cost. Now, when these individuals do actually serve their time and come out, do you have a reentry program for them after they're in prison as well? We are beginning that and just starting that, but we are trying to get those guys and their families involved in small groups in our church and then part of our discipleship classes that we have here on the outside. And just increase that spiritual development we've already begun inside the prison. And it seems to me that some of our listeners might like to contact you. So let me just mention a couple of things before we get any further, because you might be saying, okay, this has some possibilities here in my own church. So we have a link to, again, Gateway People in terms of the Twitter post, and also Gateway People in terms of the Facebook post. We also have a link to the website there as well. So if they send something to Prison Ministry or Stephen Wilson, it will get there. But I think you have an actual email that's available, don't you? Yes, we made a generic email for anybody. It's just prison@gatewaypeople.com. And that's the easiest way for people to get a hold of us, and it's easy to remember. And that's what we give the guys on the inside and tell them once you're released, send us an email and reach out to us and let us continue this growth and this development to help you when you come back. Okay, so again, somebody says, maybe I'm interested in doing that, but they're saying, can I maybe put you on an airplane and fly me to, fly you to, or fly somebody to this venue to have a conversation, or maybe get you on Skype or something like that, because this, you've, in a sense, been able to figure out how this works. No sense in another church trying to reinvent the wheel, since you've already been really successful in planting a church inside a prison. And again, this probably just rattles everybody's cages. I don't think anybody's ever heard this before, which is why I wanted to get you on, because it's just very unique, but I think it makes a great deal of sense and something that you could do in your own community. Exactly. We also have another website, gatewaynetwork.com. And on that Gateway Network website, we have posted multiple videos on each one of our programs we are doing inside the prison, so somebody can watch that and just see the how-tos, and it will walk them through exactly how to work inside.
Now, again, primarily you're working in the men's prisons right now, but there's a place for both men and women to work, right? So talk about what is available and what could be done in any community.
So our events, like you talked about us doing a marriage conference, we do a class with the men on marriage, and then we do a marriage conference inside. And that's the opportunity that we have couples from our church that then go inside and serve together and give back. And we actually have one of those coming up this weekend in one of our prisons. And it's just a great way for people just to serve together as husband and wife and go inside and give back.
Now, some of our listeners that are already involved with Prison Fellowship or Bill Glass, I can go through the long list. You know the list as well as I do. But you've always, in a sense, been able to co-teach and co-program with them as well, haven't you?
Yes, we do. Bill Glass is a great example. They go in and do an amazing evangelistic weekend inside the prisons. And then after those weekends, then we can get those guys and put them in our discipleship classes and help them continue to grow. So now we're actually teaching them how to walk that walk that they heard about, at the Bill Glass weekend.
Well, Stephen Wilson's been with us. And, Stephen, I'm going to let you go in just a minute, but just one last comment maybe from you about how difficult this was and how individuals can do this, because it seems to me that if you can give us a kind of a final word, because you've been very successful in planting one church in a prison. Now you're talking about another one. You have all sorts of other kind of reentry programs. So in some respects, you've plowed the ground. You're just encouraging other people to follow you along, aren't you?
Yes, sir, we are. Gateway Church, we're going to be planning 3 of these a year is our schedule that we're going to try to continue. So I would love for somebody to contact me, via the website or the email so that I can walk them through the steps on how to do this, because it's really making a difference in our communities when the guys get back out. And that's what I want people to remember. These guys are getting out, so let's work with them while we have them there. Teach them how to become that husband and that dad that God's called them to be. So then they'll be better in our communities when they get out.
They're your future neighbors, your future parishioners. You might as well do the training that is taking place inside the walls of those prisons right now. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring Stephen Wilson in for just a minute at Gateway Church. Just incredible ministry. We have information about it on our website, pointofview.net. If you know somebody that would benefit from this, of course, there's a place where you can download the podcast and send it on to someone. In about a day or so, it will be up on the YouTube channel, and you could send that to someone as well. And this is a way in which you can learn from some of the things that you've learned by going and planting a church inside the prison. So, Stephen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Kirby.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a couple of issues in the news. Some of those were covered yesterday by Nick Pitts, but we're going to come back to it. Some people have referred to Nike's patriotic fumble. Yeah, that was a fumble, all right. And I did not know Betsy Ross was so controversial. So we'll get into that. A whole set of questions about some of the attacks that have taken place against individuals. Portland, of course, is one example, but I have some others that we'll talk about. And then we also posted a very good piece by Victor David Hanson on why various people still think they are going to vote for President Donald Trump. So all that coming up right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, let's have an open line, 1-800-351-1212. I want to talk about a few things that Nick Pitts actually focused on yesterday, but also give some of you a chance to express your opinion. One of those is what a lot of people have called Nike's patriotic fumble. And our good friend Gary Bauer put it this way: Nike had a great idea to celebrate America's upcoming 243rd birthday with a new shoe design sporting a patriotic look by featuring the so-called Betsy Ross flag. Unfortunately, you can't buy it. Nike pulled the shoes from the stores because of a complaint from Colin Kaepernick. Now, of course, they've pointed out that there were other people that complained as well. And the argument is that seeing that flag that was first designed by Betsy Ross is associated with racism and with slavery. No, it's not. But nevertheless, that's the way they perceived it, and they pulled it. And so as a result, that's where we find ourselves. Now, again, first of all, let me be clear. It's a free country, and it is a private company, and that company can do whatever it wants. And, of course, we can do whatever we want, and we can decide whether we want to buy the product or not buy the product. And the governor of the state of Arizona can say the same thing. And if you have not seen some of these tweets by the governor, Doug Ducey said, Nike is an iconic American brand and American company. This country, our system of government and free enterprise have allowed them to prosper and flourish. One of the other tweets came out, instead of celebrating American history this week of our nation's independence, Nike has apparently decided that Betsy Ross is unworthy and has bowed to the current onslaught of political correctness and historical revisionism. Another one of the tweets said, it's a shameful retreat for the company. American businesses should be proud of our country's history, not actually abandoning it. And so then again said, Nike has made its decision, and now we're making ours. I've ordered the Arizona Commerce Authority to withdraw all financial incentive dollars under their discretion that the state was providing for the company to locate here. The Betsy Ross flag apparently is getting a little more controversial. I just had one of our staff say that a friend said that he was trying to just post a picture of the Betsy Ross flag and apparently was prevented from doing so on social media. I'll try to track some of that down and find out why. The arguments we heard there is that there might be some text. Well, almost every meme has some kind of text, or that it has stripes. And it's like, really? I mean, I'm hoping that this is a mistake, but I don't know that it is. And then watching as we have, I'm looking at the Time magazine here, trying to explain that, well, after all, this is the old version of the flag. Yeah, well, maybe that was one of the justifications, and why the Air Max 1 Quick Strike 4th of July shoe is not available to any of us to purchase. And then, of course, it goes into this whole long history about whether it was really Betsy Ross or not, and we can leave that for historians to deal with in another venue. But I'd love to get your comments. Again, Nike has the freedom to decide whether or not to put a shoe out or to decide not to put the Nike Air Max 1 Quick Strike 4th of July shoes out. That's their decision. And, of course, we can have our decision as well. Our friends at the Wall Street Journal put it this way: we commend Nike executives for their original patriotic instincts, assuming that they were sincere, but they didn't think this one through. Last year, the company launched an ad campaign featuring a black and white photo of Colin Kaepernick bearing the words, "Believe in something," even if it means sacrificing everything. Of course, it was an allusion to the decision by the NFL not to sign him. But they go on and talk about some of the story of Colin Kaepernick, which we all have heard before. And if nothing else, said in the last two paragraphs this: Nike's entitled to cancel its products for any reason, but the rest of us are entitled to point out that no flag of the United States is a symbol of oppression and racism, and that Colin Kaepernick's suggestion that it is one with Nike's tacit agreement is political theory and theater based upon false history. We're also old enough to recall when feminists considered Betsy Ross a hero, not a symbol of repression. But that's another sign of our current political insanity, say the editors of the Wall Street Journal. So they conclude with this paragraph: It's also worth remembering that harebrained controversies like this give many Americans the not unreasonable sense that their country is being maligned by pampered social justice warriors. Donald Trump has reaped enormous political benefits from the ill-judged fashion among NFL players to kneel during the national anthem, and they conclude by saying that if the president wins re-election, perhaps he should write a thank you note to Colin Kaepernick and Nike. My suggestion to Nike, if there are any people that work with Nike listening to this program, and we do have, I think, a station or two in Oregon, although I've just heard that we are going to pick up about 4 new stations, and one of those stations is in Portland, which is a place where certainly there are Nike executives. My suggestion to Nike is my same suggestion to a variety of other companies that have decided to get involved in the culture wars, whether it's Target, whether it's Home Depot, whether it's Lowe's, whoever it might be, to stay out of the culture wars. You know, you are going to offend almost anybody on one side or the other when you take these kinds of stands. And so it doesn't help the brand. And if indeed you're trying to sell shoes, it's going to be harmful to your brand. Now, I know enough about Nike to know that some people that maybe don't like Nike have decided not to buy Nike products for years, but the rest of us probably will still. And so it may not really hurt Nike in the long run. Might hurt them a little bit in the short run. I doubt it. But it might help somebody else. And that's why I love the subtitle of the Wall Street Journal piece. The company makes an in-kind donation to Trump's reelection. Couldn't have done more to try to help Donald Trump than to decide to pull shoes that have the Betsy Ross flag on them. Let me move to another issue, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. And that is, over the last couple of days, we've talked a little bit about the attack of Antifa against Andy Ngo, who is a journalist who was, first of all, beaten, was bleeding, had his camera equipment stolen, and there were people saying, well, we just threw milkshakes at him. Well, first of all, it's not a typical milkshake. It's made out of cement that's diluted, obviously, and a variety of other things that illustrate, again, the point that we've posted here by our good friend Jim Garrity. Thuggery comes to Portland, and he asked this question: how frightened are Portland institutions of Antifa, the most fascist bunch of self-proclaimed anti-fascists you'll ever see? This morning, he points out the Oregonian, which is kind of the newspaper of record for the state of Oregon, the biggest and most important newspaper in the state, describes an assault by talking about the fact that a Oregon reporter caught the attack on video, though the video doesn't show what precipitated the attack. Of course, the implication is there may have been something that the reporter did that provoked the attack. That's not the case. But nevertheless, we do have the videos of men punching him, kicking him, throwing objects at him, and dousing him with some sort of liquid, they say. Of course, they don't point out that they also stole his camera. And the idea is, well, we just don't want to take sides on this particular issue. And then they talk about the fact that the headline itself is this: Portland mayor, police come under fire after right-wing writer attacked at protest. So again, this is like, well, he's a conservative, so, he probably deserved that. And they're being criticized instead of pointing out the attack on this individual. And so this is, I think, just a good illustration of one of the other articles that I read from yesterday, but we've posted today, which I entitled Shunning, Shaming, and Attacking. And this piece by Byron York that appeared in the Washington Examiner goes through all sorts of examples. One of those is due to an op-ed that was in the Washington Post by Stephanie Wilkinson. She was the owner of that restaurant that kicked out Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who then justifies in the op-ed why she did that, and then goes on to say that then when Eric Trump was spat on in a bar in Chicago, this just illustrates that new rules apply in public accommodations when you are part of an organization we do not like. And so you're starting to see more and more people making this argument. Then you have another one that appeared in the New York Times by Kate Cronin Furman, who is a professor, that actually argued that if anything, we should now start doxing. That's where you release private information about employees of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency so that we can shame them and force them maybe to leave the part of the government, or at least to try to be more humane in the way they treat individuals. So he concludes with this comment: shunning, shaming, doxing, attacking. As the 2020 campaign reaches full speed, would it surprise anyone to see all of it increase? And all from people who congratulate themselves for standing against hate, but then they do hateful things towards others. We're in a new age, and I hope that we can protect ourselves from those who want to attack us. I'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just for just a few minutes maybe pick up on something I just mentioned in passing, and that is the attack against Andy Ngo. When we talked about it on Monday, just talked about him being a journalist, and because the Oregonian said right-wing writer, and since some have said conservative journalist, first of all, that's not true. If you've ever had a chance to hear Andy Ngo address some of these issues, he is not a conservative, but it fits the meme a lot better for those that really want to sort of justify his attack. And again, when they say, we don't know what precipitated the attack, it's like, okay, The implication of that is that maybe he did something to provoke the crowd. That is not the case. And I have in front of me here some other articles that remind us of other journalists from NBC and CNN in other situations that were attacked as well. So it doesn't matter whether it was a CNN reporter, an MSNBC reporter, or an individual that's a freelance journalist. This guy, first of all, has been attacked. He was bleeding. You can see some of the pictures here. I won't go into all that. You can watch the video. Ted Cruz has called for an investigation. There have been 3 people that have been charged, as we talked about on Monday. But nevertheless, I just thought I would clarify a few issues, even though I was just sort of reading from how the Oregonian chose to cover it. The reality is that they're even putting a spin on an incident that is pretty scary in light of what has been taking place over the last couple of years, and even more so in light of the piece that we have posted. It is actually the second piece called Shunning, Shaming, and Attacking, because there's where Byron York goes into more detail in which he points out that some of the arguments for this would be appropriate are showing up in, for example, this op-ed by Stephanie Wilkinson that appeared in the Washington Post. And she was the owner of that restaurant in Lexington, Virginia, that kicked out Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and then talks about the waitress that spat on Eric Trump and sort of says, this is kind of the new rules that apply. Then you have, as I mentioned just a minute ago, this piece by Kate Cronin Furman that appeared in the New York Times. Again, this is the record. This is really the journal of record that is saying that one of the ways we can, if you will, fight back against what is happening in these detention centers at the U.S.-Mexico border is to be involved in doxing. And I think she sort of says, well, this is really not an argument for it. Byron York points out, in light of what she said, this really is an argument for it. And then talks about, finally, the attack against Andy Ngo. So those are examples of whether it's a freelance journalist that's been attacked in Portland or mainstream journalists that were attacked back in Charlottesville or other places. And then also editorials that have appeared in such things as the Washington Post and the New York Times. And so I posted these so that you can kind of get a little better perspective on that. And I do want to take a phone call or two, but also, if we have time, want to talk about the very, I think, thoughtful essay by Victor Davis Hanson, What Progressives Should Know About Trump Voters. Because you may be one of those people who say, how could anybody now, after these years, vote for Donald Trump? And yet there is a very significant number that say they are going to vote for him. And I think these 10 points that Victor Davis Hanson put together are, I think, very well done, and maybe would be helpful for those of you that plan on voting for Donald Trump, and maybe others that say, I'd never vote for him, but I want to understand why people would. But let's take some phone calls first. We'll go to North Carolina, and Peggy, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
I am just really hurt that America is being torn apart because of racism. And I don't think Betsy Ross had any intention to be racist when she made the flag the original 13 colonies or states. And it just, I think enough is enough. They've torn down monuments everywhere because supposedly these people were racist, and I don't understand that, but I really think that the people on the left side and the right side, there's going to be prices to pay. It's just getting unreal. And I lived through the 60s, and this is a whole lot worse than it was back then.
Well, again, some of that's coming from the college campuses. And I did mention earlier, but let me mention it again, that I posted a piece on my own Facebook page, also on Instagram, which just entitled, Apparently These Two People Are More Controversial Than I Realized. And it's a picture of George Washington with Betsy Ross. I've already got about 60 posts, comments, likes, those kinds of things. I mean, and again, who would have thought that George Washington would be controversial? Although apparently it was, because they painted over a mural of George Washington in San Francisco the other day. And who especially would have ever thought that Betsy Ross would be controversial? But that, I think, shows you why we certainly like to spend time on a fairly regular basis talking about, if you will, America's godly heritage and looking at our history. There are some very dark chapters in American history. The Indian Wars, slavery are two very dark chapters in American history, but there is also quite a bit of evidence of American exceptionalism. And it has been interesting to watch the reaction to the decision by Nike to pull all of this, because now I'm starting to find some of these posts where individuals are saying, like, for example, this one from the New York Times opinion page, "The myth of America as the greatest nation on earth is at best outdated and at worst wildly inaccurate. If you look at data, the U.S. is really just okay." Really? Michael Medved, who's been on this program with us before, oftentimes, not often, every day, I guess, starts his program by saying, the greatest nation on God's green earth. And, of course, he talks about the greatness of America. And he said over time that people will sometimes come up to him after there's been some incident internationally or nationally and say, "Do you still think America is the greatest nation on God's green earth?" And his question to them, his answer is a question, basically, "Can you think of a better one?" And sometimes they'll come up with something like, Switzerland or Sweden or Norway or something like that. And then he'll go through some of the facts real quickly, and they'll go, "Okay, you win." Yes, in terms of freedom, in terms of opportunity, in terms of the things that this nation has provided to the rest of the world and has been a blessing, it really is still the greatest nation on God's green earth. At least that's his argument. And yet you're seeing today all sorts of Facebook posts and Twitter posts and others saying, this was a good decision by Nike to pull all of the product and to not get involved in saying anything positive about this nation. So I will leave it at that. And in the next hour, we're going to spend some time talking with Hillary Ferrer about apologetics, and that'll change the topic, which is probably one that you'd like to change anyway. But just before we end this hour, let me mention that I have posted this piece by Victor Davis Hanson, 10, I think, pretty cogent arguments about what progressives should know about Trump voters, and why is it that Donald Trump has been still having such support among so many individuals. And it isn't just the economy, although it's certainly that. It isn't just some of the other things that he's opposed, whether it's the Green New Deal or a variety of other topics, but it's just a whole series of issues that he takes on. And so we've posted that as our third article for you to read today. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how to defend the Christian faith, and I think you're really going to enjoy this. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to Point of View any length of time, you know that there are two things we always like to do. First of all, help you articulate a biblical worldview, and number two, enable you to be able to defend a biblical worldview. And that second point is what we call apologetics. That is something that has been a real interest on mine for many years, and one of the things that we've always wanted to do is equip you so that you can answer the questions that people are asking every single day. But at the same time, we also have over the years noticed that there haven't been quite as many women who are apologists, which is why we on a regular basis oftentimes called upon people like Nancy Pearcey. And even when I was the president of the International Society of Christian Apologetics, we made a point of bringing in people like Mary Jo Sharp. More recently, of course, we've also interviewed Melissa Travis and others. So the number of women that are now addressing this issue of apologetics is increasing. And this hour, I wanted to introduce you to another who has written just an outstanding book, almost 300 pages, entitled Mama Bear Apologetics, Empowering Your Kids to Challenge Cultural Lies. And our guest is Hillary Ferrer, who is the founder of Mama Bear Apologetics. We have a link to the website. I've always appreciated her because not only does she have an expertise in the area of apologetics, but like me, she also has a master's degree in biology. And so to bring not only this understanding of philosophy, but science as well, shows up in her book and is one of the reasons why I really do commend this book to you. It is out. It is published by Harvest House. And as a matter of fact, not surprising, the foreword is written by our friend Nancy Pearcey. So, Hillary, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me.
I might mention that you are sort of the general editor, although quite a number of the chapters, the 16 chapters in there, are written by you or by some of your associates. But talk about that for just a minute before we get into the book, because you've put together a group of like-minded women, some who have children, others who do not. But it doesn't really matter. Whether you have children or grandchildren or don't, you're going to be teaching Sunday school classes. You're going to be with young people. So I think everybody can benefit from some of the conversation we have here. But you've put together a group of very smart women that have helped us understand how to answer some of these really important questions in the 21st century.
That we have to this book, and the process that we did in editing this book, I think, is really what makes it special. We had Skype meetings every single week where we would read the chapters out loud to each other, and we'd have the documents up in front of us, and people would say, wait, I'm not so sure about that, or what about phrasing it like this way? So there really is a little bit of all of us in every chapter, but I think every single person brings kind of a unique perspective and a unique contribution to the book that it wouldn't have been if it had just been me writing.
Well, again, it is published by Harvest House, so I think people can benefit from that. And explain the idea of the Mama Bear Way, because even before we get into those chapters, you have a little section there that explains this idea of mama bears.
Yeah, so the mama bear, a lot of times people think mama bears like rise up and attack, and so that's not exactly what we're going for. But there is an instinct to do something you wouldn't normally do because you see something happening to your children. You see your children being threatened in some way. And so I kind of start out with a story about a woman named Jody who was not an academic, and she was a fitness instructor. She raised her kids in church in Awana, and she thought she did everything right. And then her youngest son comes back from his first job and says, yeah, I think I'm an atheist. My boss says that Jesus is like Santa Claus. And she was just floored. And so she had never read anything apologetics, but she asked, what are your questions? What are some of your questions? And so in between times when he would come back and forth from home, she just studied all these books that she wouldn't normally do, learning about postmodernism and just the shift in cultural worldview, basically from that happened while her kids were in school. And she was saying, why did nobody tell?
Joe, again, have we lost you? Well, maybe we have. Again, we are talking about this book called Mama Bear Apologetics, Empowering Your Kids to Challenge Cultural Lives. She is the general editor for Harvest House Publishers. And again, we're going to be looking at a couple of really important topics in this particular conversation today. And if nothing else, before it's all through, we'll get into some of these heavy names and words and isms like naturalism and postmodernism. But one of the things I love about it is it's communicated in a very positive way. Hillary, let's see if we can just talk about why apologetics. I love the subtitle here. There's so many sort of laugh out loud sections. Calling all mama bears, my kid has a Cheerio shoved up his nose. Why am I reading this book? I love that line. And a lot of people might say apologetics, well, that's for you academic sorts. But really, knowing how to defend the Christian faith is going to be something we really need to know in the 21st century, don't you think?
Absolutely. And so there's a whole bunch of little humorous things in this book that come from, I got to say, Hillary Short, one of our contributors in all our meetings. She would just kind of say something. She's like, well, some moms are going to ask why they want to read this. They're just trying to get the Cheerio out of their kid's nose. And I said, that needs to be one of the chapter titles. So I love Hillary Short, but I'm sorry, what was the question?
But again, just the idea, we're going to have to really know how to answer those questions, because some people say apologetics, that's for you guys that go to seminary. No, I think it's going to be something we're going to have to know a lot in the 21st century.
Oh, absolutely. And especially because of the chapter on emotionalism, I think that's going to go through that chapter is kind of a culmination of a lot of the stuff in the book. Your children are, the idea of absolute truth is being attacked, the fact that we can know absolute truth, that it exists, and that is separate from our feelings, that right there is becoming the minority position. And so everything we try to teach them in Scripture is being undermined by these different isms that we talk about in the book. And so I like to start the book out talking about my testimony, because a lot of times people hear apologetics and how it helps kids, and they talk about it in the hypothetical. Like we do that. We talk about all the statistics of the youth exodus, because I think in order to raise up that mama bear, she has to realize, oh, wow, my kids really are in danger here. But also to give some encouragement of, like, this isn't just a hypothetical that this will help your kids' faith. I was one of those kids who had apologetics presented to me at 12 years old, and I will still, to this day, I will go back to the series that my pastor did as the reasons for not walking away from the faith. And so if your kid is anything like me, I can't imagine I'm the only one. Apologetics is going to be one of the ways, not necessarily that we have to evangelize people into the faith. Apologetics is for keeping people in the faith. A lot of times I think churches are so focused on the front door of getting people into the church that they leave the back door completely unguarded, and we have people leaving in droves from the back door, and the apologists are sitting there waving our hands saying, we need to close the back door here so people stop leaving, and people who are really gung-ho for evangelism saying, no, we need to evangelize more. These are not two separate things that need to, it's not an either or. These both need to be happening in order to be keeping the church full and healthy.
Very good. Nancy Pearsley talks about the question she had as well as you do. So when we come back, let's see if we can get into some of those isms. Of course, we talked about emotionalism, postmodernism, moral relativism, naturalism, a lot of them. So we'll get into some of those and give you some ideas on how to respond. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about the progress of religious liberty in this country due to the recent Supreme Court ruling. Today, I'd like to put all of this in a larger context of the religious culture war. Fortunately, David French has already done much of the hard work on this in his commentary on this subject. Early on, he explains his mission. Although the federal government should protect religious liberty and seek the common good, we Christians have a responsibility as well. He says while citizens should seek to influence their nation through government, their first responsibility is to exercise their liberty towards virtuous ends. His first concern is that often our progressive government fails to protect the free exercise of religion that he says is plainly illiberal and contrary to the constitutional order. The government passes sweeping and intrusive statutes and regulations and then treats the free exercise and free speech claims of religious individuals and institutions as a form of special pleading. That turns the Constitution on its head. But his second concern is focused on us. He admits that while religious conservatives are right to fight for their liberties, we need to understand that no government or cultural institution is more responsible for the decline of the church than the church itself. As I've documented in previous commentaries, most surveys of non-believers and believers who have left the church find Christians to be intolerant and hypocritical. David French points us to 1 Corinthians 5, verses 9 to 12, where Paul calls for those in Corinth to focus on the sin within their church body. Often, he argues, we are more intolerant of the sin we see in the world than in the sin we see in the church. We need to be faithful in our witness before the watching world, but we also need to make sure our witness inside the church matches our words. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Hillary Ferrer with us, and the book is entitled Mama Bear Apologetics. She's the general editor, but also the author of many of the chapters, and endorsed by so many individuals, forward by Nancy Piercy, who's been on the program with us, and just to mention a few others that have been on with us, J. Warner Wallace, Sean McDowell, Melissa Kane Travis, Craig Hazen, Mary Jo Sharp, and others that have put some great endorsements of this book. And Hillary, before we get to some of those isms, one of the chapters I felt was very helpful, and one that we talk about so often here on Point of View, is Chapter 3, The Discerning Mama Bear, of the refined art of chew and spit. We'll get into that in just a minute. But this issue of discernment, one of the things I'm trying to do so often here on Point of View is help people to have discernment about political comments being made, economic justifications that are being given, but also in terms of various kinds of truth claims being made. And we're going to have to really hone our ability to have discernment. And so you have some very concrete and helpful ideas about how to develop discernment. Can you share those?
Yeah, so we've got the steps to discernment, but what I would like to talk about before is one of the main reasons why we want to have discernment.
Sure.
Because, I mean, it's not just because it's a biblical mandate, but what I find generally in the general populace is that people are speaking in ways that are just inflammatory. They will give their side of the story. They'll give it, with boldness, and they won't try to build any bridges with the people that they are disagreeing with. And what that does, and this comes again from the scientific background of fight or flight, it puts people in fight or flight when they feel threatened in some way. And once a person enters fight or flight, you have lost the ability to have any kind of rational conversation with them. So the steps that we have for discernment are not just for having discernment for yourselves, but they really teach you how to interact with culture without putting people into fight or flight, to where they might be able to actually hear and be persuaded by some of the arguments you have, instead of just getting angry and bolstering their position even more in their mind, and then you just have two angry people talking to each other and you get nowhere. So the idea of discernment in here, we put it into a ROAR acronym, just, because we're the mama bears. We got to have ROAR acronyms. So the R stands for recognize the message. And this is where you have to understand what is actually being peddled in this movie, in this song, in this play, whatever it is. What is the main message that is there? Sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not. But you have to recognize it first. The second step is offer discernment, and this comes in a very specific order. And I cannot stress this enough, that you have to recognize the good, recognize the bad, affirm the good, reject the bad. I'll say it again. Recognize the good, recognize the bad, affirm the good, reject the bad. Mm-hmm. What we're trying to do is we're trying to separate the good and the bad ideas. There's a lot of people who just assume that if culture is coming out with an idea, that it's automatically wrong. And so they feel like, the Bible and culture are always going to be at odds, to the point of where they cannot recognize when culture is making a legitimate point. There's a quote by Walter Martin from the book Kingdom of the Cults that says, the cults are the church's unpaid bills. So every time we see a movement that we maybe disagree with is really kind of moving against Christianity, we need to be self-reflective and say they're picking up on something that the church probably has not been doing well in self-critique. So, for example, with progressive Christianity, there might have been some ways where the church really had been unloving in a lot of ways and had not been following the heart of Jesus and had been too much into doctrine. And while what's going on in progressive Christianity, they solved the problem by basically relativizing Scripture. That's not what we want to do. We have to look at what their intention was. And so in every single one of these isms, we look at what was the good intention there. So we affirm the good, and that builds bridges and conversation. But then we have to reject the bad. We look at the lies that are being slipped in. So that's the R and the O, recognize the message, offer discernment. And then A is argue for a healthier approach, where we're going to take what is the good that this worldview was trying to address? What was that unpaid bill that they were trying to correct? And how can we take it to Scripture and say, well, actually, Scripture addresses this, and there's a more biblical way to address this than the way this faulty worldview is addressing it. So that's how we're going to argue for that healthier approach. And then finally, reinforce through discussion, discipleship, and prayer. We just give little tips on conversations to have with your kids. And then Julie Lose, amazing woman. She's been with Moms in Prayer for almost 20 years, went out and charted each chapter out and wrote theologically rich prayers that you could pray over your children regarding each one of these cultural lies. You did a great job.
I might just mention, too, that at the end of each one of these chapters, there are discussion questions. So some of our listeners out there that might say, this might be something I'd really like to do in a Bible study or a fellowship group or something of that nature. You have an icebreaker, some main themes, self-evaluation, brainstorm, release the bear. So there are some great material. Let's get into some isms. And since you mentioned this idea of emotionalism, follow your heart, it never lies. And if that's one thing that we've picked up when we had Jonathan just recently on some of the other guests that we've had on the program, they've talked about this idea of always believe what you feel. And so one of the things that we are really dealing with, Hillary, is a whole generation, especially the millennial generation and the so-called Generation Z, that really do believe you should follow your heart. So how do we respond to that?
Yes. Would you mind if I read a little passage from the book? That's one of my favorite passages that,
Sure.
that addresses this. So this is from the Follow Your Heart, It Never Lies. It's page 171. And it says, the problem with using our emotions for determining truth is that they have to first be conformed to truth.
Guess we lost you again. Let's see if we can get her back on. And we'll see if we can get her back on. I'll just read it because she was reading it at the time. The problem with using your emotions for determining truth is that you first have to be conformed to truth in order to tell us anything useful. For a compass to work, it must first be magnetized, otherwise it won't point to true north. Discipling our emotions with truth is like magnetizing our emotional compass. We can follow our emotions, but only after we have made sure our emotional compass is pointing in the right direction. So again, one of the points that you were making, Hillary, is that you can use the example of a compass. It has to be magnetized in order for it to know that it's pointing to true north, right?
Yep, that's correct.
And so again, I read that piece. So again, how do we respond to this idea of emotionalism? And it again gets back to this idea of roar, because you need to recognize the particular message, and then you have to begin to work our way through each one of those points. So what would you suggest?
I think humor is actually one of the best ways to get this message across, because as soon as you start giving a lecture, your kids are going to know that you're giving a lecture, and they're going to start rolling their eyes and tuning you out. But if you turn it into kind of a game where you're trying to find examples of things that don't match the idea. So, for example, craft fairs are awesome, for all these just ridiculous things printed on jewelry and T-shirts. And I was walking around with my husband the other day at one, and it was a necklace that said, "All good things are wild and free." And my first immediate thought, and this is kind of weird because I don't have diabetes, I thought, not insulin. I want my insulin to be controlled and stable. And so when you see something like that, you can ask your kids, is that true? Are all good things wild and free? What about, then you can start making, what about a raccoon in your attic? What about,
yes.
All sorts of things that just ask them to come up with examples, funny examples. So what's happening is when you're laughing, they're wanting to participate more in this, and they're wanting to think of more funny examples. What that's doing is it's really bearing this concept in their heart, so that one day when someone comes up to them saying this for real, they're like, yeah, my parents and I thought of about 1,000 different ways that is not true. And so probably the way you're saying it's probably not true either. But it doesn't have to be done in lecture form. It's done kind of in a game form. I think games are a great way to do it. And honestly, with Pinterest and craft fairs, there is an endless opportunity to find completely nonsensical statements.
Lots of great examples. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Hillary Ferrer. And while we're talking about apologetics, again, we all lamented the loss of Dr. Norm Geisler on Monday, who was in some respects been called the godfather of apologetics. And so if nothing else, did want to acknowledge that. First met that individual when I was editing his book on the roots of evil, and we've done many debates over the years with other atheists and evolutionists and others, and so just a great loss. And so did want to acknowledge that as we are talking today with one of the best examples I think we have of one of the up-and-coming apologists, Hillary Ferrer, and the various women associated with Mama Bear Apologetics. We'll continue our conversation with her right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Talking about Mama Bear Apologetics. Hillary Ferrer is with us. And I might just mention real quickly that if you go to their website, and we have a link on our website, pointofview.net, it is mamabearapologetics.com, but you don't even have to know how to spell all that out. Just simply click on that link next to the picture by Hillary Ferrer. Or, of course, we also have information about the book. It's available both in paperback and Kindle. And, of course, you may be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've also made it very easy for you to find it there. But, Hillary, just before we get back to the book, let's talk about what's on your website, because you have a blog, you have podcasts, you have a variety of great resources. So when people land on the website, what will they find?
Yeah, we have. So one of the things I wanted to do early on was podcast, and it took a while to learn how to do that. But I find that sometimes women don't have time to always just sit down and read, but they can multitask. And one of these specific things that women are really good at multitasking at is following a conversation. You can have a mom that's doing 3 different things in one room, and then she hears a fight going on in the other room, and she knows exactly what happened, exactly who said what, because for some reason we can follow conversations no matter what else we're doing. So we took the podcast and we said, let's make this a conversation, not just like a lecture of, it's hard to follow lectures while you're doing something else. So we have different co-hosts that come on, and we just pick a topic and we discuss it back and forth, and then we give really good, something a lot of people don't know. We have very extensive podcast notes that will go through any resources that we mention, any person that we mention, links to that, any unfamiliar vocabulary, some of the favorite quotes that were from there, and just give you everything you need so that you don't have to feel like, oh, what was that book she mentioned? I can't find it. Just go to the podcast notes and you can find it there. Secondly, we just have blogs just because they're nice, short, little things. And this also gives me a way to be raising up other women who have a voice but who may not have the time to have their own ministry. And I say, hey, what is something that you're passionate about? How can we get you involved with Mama Bear Apologetics? Because I am all about just helping women to be raised up in their own spirit, to kind of find their own little specialty, their own niche. So we have lots of blogs there that aren't too long. And then finally, we have something called the Audio Apologetics blog, which had to be put on hold for a little bit because the girl that was doing it had a baby, but she should be starting up again. And that's where we just find articles on the web that we think are important, and we read them, because sometimes, again, moms don't have the time to just go and search and read every single thing. But if you can have someone read you the article, that's a whole lot easier, and it can be a shorter version of a podcast than the longer ones that we have for the full-blown podcast.
So again, all sorts of material at mamabearapologetics.com. The book is, of course, entitled Mama Bear Apologetics. It's published by Harvest House. And let's, if we can, maybe look at another ism, naturalism, simply because you have a science background. And for our listeners today that are maybe listening to or reading Breakpoint, of course, the focus today by our good friend John Stonestreet was about this video called Science Uprising, and one of the videos unmasks materialism. So when we talk about materialism or naturalism, that's still the predominant worldview. And so how do we address that, whether our kids are maybe getting it in school or they're watching it when they watch a Discovery Channel or National Geographic Channel, or they're reading one of the so-called new atheists? How do we respond?
Well, first off, I think it's important to realize that it itself is a self-refuting statement, this idea that we will only believe anything by natural causes alone. That statement right there, there is no test tube in the world that you can test that in. That is a philosophical statement. And so one of the things that I want women to realize, or I want everyone to realize, is that everybody starts out with a philosophical premise, a philosophical statement, a philosophical worldview that they base their science on. And what is happening is that people who are in the sciences that are the hardcore evolutionists are basically saying, my starting philosophy is more scientific than your starting philosophy. And that's just not true. And so a lot of times, instead of having to answer all the specific questions about science, which I find people sometimes steer away from science because they feel like they have to maybe have a master's in it to really understand it, or they have to know all the details. If you know how to properly pick apart a question to where you can kind of show that whatever statement this person is making isn't a valid statement to begin with, you don't even have to start answering all the questions with all the, tons and tons of evidence. You can say that's not a valid question. And so this idea of naturalism, it's not a valid thing to say that this is the absolute that we start on and it's scientific. It's not. It's philosophical.
So again, those are some helpful ideas. And part of it is just to say, in some respects, the idea is self-refuting. And people say, what do you mean by that? It'd be like saying, I can't speak English. You just used English to speak that, or my brother's an only child. These are self-refuting kinds of ideas. And so as a result, you have just an ability in some of these very important articles to help people deal with that. Another one that's kind of related to this is skepticism, and you have co-authored that chapter as well. And it's kind of interesting because you even start out by talking about one of the debates between a person that's been on the program with us before, Daniel Wallace against Bart Ehrman. Daniel Wallace used to be at Pro Ministries with us. And this is, again, just this kind of the old atheist, new atheist. So whether they're a naturalist or a skeptic, that's a case where sometimes we as Christians kind of are intimidated and we don't know how to respond. Can you give us some possible ideas about what we might say?
Well, first off, I think we need to look at the difference between the old atheist and the new atheist. The old atheist, I think, had a more honest position. And by honest, I mean it was a position that was debatable. So the old atheist had the position of there is no God. And the con position of that would be there is a God. That's great. That's a debate we can have. The new atheists have now changed the definition of atheism to I lack God belief. So can you tell me what the con position of God belief is? Yeah. It's saying, no, you don't lack God belief. So if we want to have a debate with them, that's the con position. That's a really stupid con position. There's no way in the world I can argue that you actually believe in God. It's an undebatable tenet. And so what happens is we have the new atheist saying, I lack God belief. And then we have the Christian saying, there is a God. And these are two completely different.
Yes, they are.
They're two different debates. And so the Christian just feels beat down because the new atheist keeps saying, I don't have any burden of proof. I'm not even making a claim. I'm just saying I lack God belief. All the burden of proof is on you. And oh my goodness, the number of Christians that keep falling for this, and then they scramble chasing their tail, trying to provide all this evidence for God, when the kind of the thesis of this chapter is the evidence isn't the issue. When it comes to hyper-skepticism, so we're talking more about hyper-skepticism in this chapter than just skepticism alone, that the evidence really isn't the issue. And so if you sit there and you just spin your wheels trying to provide evidence, first off, a lot of the evidence that you provide, they're going to outright deny that even counts. So it's kind of this position of there's not a single shred of evidence except for all the evidence that I won't count as evidence. And so just in this book in general, it's learning how to take the questions or how to take the positions and kind of dissect them to where you realize this isn't an honest position to start with. And so I don't have to start giving all this burden of proof information when the person isn't starting in an honest position to begin with.
Right.
So that would be kind of the skepticism chapter there.
Well, one of the things I find interesting is they'll say, well, it's really not a position. It's just a sort of a default. In other words, I don't have any evidence. And I said, well, for a non-position, you spend an enormous amount of time doing debates. You spend time writing books. There are T-shirts. There are websites, for this so-called non-position. If somebody said, well, I don't take a position on Thor or Zeus, but I don't spend any time trying to disprove Thor or Zeus or anything like that. So anyway, that's another part of that interesting, I'm going to sit out here on an island and anything you say doesn't count as proof because, after all, I'm not really taking a position in the first place. So that is a little bit... Yeah. Anyway, I need to take a break. When we come back, I want to pick out one more of the isms. Again, this book is full of chapters, and we've only covered a few, so you can obviously see why you need to get a copy of the book. But I thought we'd get back to a big issue that's got a big word, but we'll break it down, and that is postmodernism, this idea that truth is there is no truth. What do you deal with somebody that says there is no truth? And, of course, the question is, well, is that a truth statement? And, of course, we can have some fun with that as well. But we're going to take a break. And if you would like to know a little bit more about this great resource or just the website itself, I hope that you'll take the time, even if you're traveling right now, on this 4th of July weekend, of course, our weekend that's coming up here. We hope that you will write down mamabearapologetics.com, and when you get in front of a computer, check it out. Or, of course, if you don't have a chance, just simply visit our website, pointofview.net. You'll find information about this book. It is available in your local bookstore, but if you have any trouble finding it, of course, you can get it off their website as well. And there are all sorts of other great resources that I think you're going to find helpful. Let's take a break. We'll come back and talk about this big word, postmodernism, right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
The book is Mama Bear Apologetics, Empowering Your Kids to Challenge Cultural Lies. Whether you're a child or an adult, I think you're going to benefit tremendously from this. Let me also mention that each chapter ends with some discussion questions, which I think you can use to actually begin a teaching on this. And you look at this, there's 16 different chapters. I mean, you could actually devote a quarter to one a week, or you could put a couple of them together. And so let me commend the book to you in that regard. But Hillary, just before we run out of time, let's see if we can tackle one of the other isms. The truth is there is no truth, postmodernism. It's a big word for saying there's absolutely no evidence of absolute truth. But, of course, is that an absolute comment? right? What about this?
Exactly. Yeah. Is that true? This is going to be one of those circular reasoning and self-refuting statements all in one.
So what do we do, and how do we teach our kids and even ourselves to kind of, first of all, evaluate it and then argue for a better approach?
Well, first off, I think it's as parents, we need to understand where the idea of postmodernism came from. And we actually devote a lot of time in this book with the first, I can't remember how many chapters, going through the pre-modern, modern, and postmodern times to see every single kind of epic of ideas had something that the next epoch objected against, and so they would swing the pendulum in the exact opposite direction. So if you have your pre-moderns, they thought that all truth comes from the gods, but then you had the problem with all this religious infighting, and so people thought, well, with all this disagreement with religion, that can't be the way to truth. Okay, so now we're going to switch to modernism, and that's where the kind of Age of Enlightenment, the scientific revolution occurred, and said, we're only going to go along with what we can observe with our five senses, what can be tested with the scientific method. And they thought that not just scientific truth could be determined that way, but that ultimate truth, kind of like the meaning of life and our purpose here, all of that stuff. They thought if we just pool our collective reasoning, we'll come to the same conclusion. Well, I mean, it doesn't take long to figure out that people using their own minds are going to come to lots of different conclusions. Anyone who has kids, if you can get them to agree on what to have for dinner, that's a good night. So this idea that we thought that we could get all of humanity to agree on the meaning of life was kind of silly. But so then you moved into the pendulum swung one more time and said, okay, well, we thought we could have absolute certainty and know everything through this method. No, everybody's disagreeing. So we're just going to say that there is absolutely no way to know truth. And it started with that. Is that there's no way to know truth. Some postmodernists will go so far to say there is no absolute truth, which, of course, as you said, is that absolutely true? It's kind of easy to refute. But if they just say there's no way for us to know it, well, again, you can also say, well, how do you know that? There's so many ways that these ideologies can't even get off the ground in the first sentence, really. And so kind of knowing how to combat those are important. But anyway, moving on to just what has turned into now is that truth, since we said that there's no way to know truth, now all of a sudden everybody is responsible for their own truth. And so a phrase that you keep seeing throughout this entire book and that you'll see out in culture is putting a possessive pronoun in front of truth, saying, well, this is my truth. That's his truth. She's living her truth. And this idea of truth being but one and excluding falsehood is starting to become something that's considered an oppressive statement, as if the people who are in charge, they're taking truth and then they're saying, my truth is the biggest truth because it keeps me in power. And so when your children are steeped in this and then they hear Jesus say something like, I am the truth, the way, the truth, and the life, that word truth, people bristle at it because they think it's a bully technique. And that's a really dangerous place, I guess, to become when you start seeing truth as a bully technique. And that's exactly what's happening right now.
Well, let's again, just before we wind down the program today, talk about how people can use this book, because we've only picked out just a very, very few, as you recognize, chapters in the book. But it gives people, I think, a good sample of what is available as you talk about everything from self-helpism and naturalism and skepticism and postmodernism to things like moral relativism, pluralism, the new spirituality, even things like Marxism and feminism, as well as just some general and introductory material. But this is a book that certainly a mom or a dad should have trying to answer kids' questions. But I think all of us can benefit from this, and I hope that anybody that's teaching any kind of Sunday school class with young people has a copy of this, because it will help them be much more effective in terms of teaching and, most importantly, knowing how to answer the questions that are in the minds of these young people, which they want to ask. And if we can answer their questions inside the church, they're not going to be heading out the back door that you just talked about, right?
Absolutely. So the question is, how would I like to see people use this?
Yes.
Well, I think women like doing things together. I've already had groups of women sending me pictures of them meeting in parks, all of them holding up their books, and the discussion questions. I really like the discussion questions that we made at the end. There's the discussion questions for talking with your kids, but then there's a second set of discussion questions for if women are doing kind of a group study together. And they're not the normal just regurgitate what was said in the chapter. They're really thought-provoking and will really give people an opportunity to explore these ideas, to talk them through, to kind of figure them out for themselves, see where they stand, see what's right, see what's wrong. And I think it's really great for conversation. And so I think the best way to do it, I would like to see people doing this together. And then I want to see you send me more pictures of y'all doing it together, because I love seeing pictures of a whole group holding up their books, doing it together at a park in Southern California. It just makes me happy.
Well, again, you can do that by going to mamabearapologetics.com. There's a place to contact, as well as there's a blog, there's a podcast, there's a contact section, and a lot of resources. So, Hillary Ferrer, thank you so very much for being with us on Point of View, and appreciate you writing the book and pulling together all these authors. And thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much.
We are going to say goodbye, but just before we do so, let me mention that tomorrow is the 4th of July. My commentary deals with the Declaration of Independence, so I hope that you will maybe take the time to at least read the commentary. One of the articles and interviews that we've already taped is about the politically incorrect guide to the American Revolution, so I think you're really going to enjoy that. But certainly as we talk about the Declaration, we recognize that Thomas Jefferson was influenced by people like John Locke in his 2 treatises of government, in which he talked about the laws of nature and nature's God. Well, we understand nature's God. That's certainly the idea of God's revelation. The law of nature is kind of the general revelation, or what's called natural law, and that was very important. And as I point out in my commentary, the Declaration of Independence really was a bold document, but it was not a radical one like the French Revolution. Instead, they came to the conclusion that they only wanted to separate from England for not because of light and transient causes, but instead they said when there had been a long train of abuses and usurpations, they felt that then it was the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government. And so you might even want to read the Declaration of Independence tomorrow. It's just a great exercise in reminding us of the birth certificate of America. And then on Friday, my commentary is on what's called constitutional revisionism, in which a writer for the magazine of Williamsburg actually asked people to suggest changes they might make to America's founding document. So those are just some of the resources we make available at our website, pointofview.net. And as you go there, you can find information about this book, some of the other articles we mentioned in the first hour, and most importantly, my Viewpoints commentaries that you can sign up for. Also would encourage you to click on that button that says donate. But most importantly, I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Enjoy the 4th of July tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.